Dear Prime Minister Kristersson, State Secretary, Ambassadors, dear Professor van Middelaar, dear students, faculty, staff, and guests of the Hertie School. It is a true honor to welcome a head of government to the Hertie School, and we're incredibly pleased, Mr. Prime Minister, that you have taken the time in your busy schedule to share your ideas, insights, and experience with our students just before your meeting with Chancellor Olaf Scholz. It is a double privilege for us, as you're not just Prime Minister of Sweden, but you also hold the presidency of the Council of the European Union. What a wonderful occasion for us to hear your thoughts on the Swedish presidency running from January to June, halfway through. I could not imagine a better time than ours to discuss the values that bring us together, the responsibilities we share, and the challenges we have to address urgently in mutual respect and cooperation. One tends to say that Europe grows together in crisis. I place all my hopes in this wisdom because we've certainly been dealt a fair share in recent months. Above all, the terrible war in Ukraine, the brutal Russian invasion, the blatant disregard of Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, and the fierce opposition to European values that are at its roots have toppled our convictions in Germany, in Sweden, and everywhere in Europe. We have seen how urgent it is to come together and stand behind Ukraine. And you have visited Kiev only 1 month ago to meet with Volodymyr Zelensky in an important sign of solidarity and support. Now, it will not escape the astute observer that the Swedish flag shares its colors with the flag of Ukraine, incidentally also the colors of the flag of the European Union. So let blue and yellow be the colors we fly in support of liberal democracy on the European continent. But even with the title of your keynote, you have added another color, green, to remind us that we have not just one challenge to meet. Europe has an important role to play in the fight for the health of our planet, and we've now understood that energy, security, and well-being are intimately linked. Building a future for Europe, a greener Europe, a safer Europe, a freer Europe, must occur simultaneously. Indeed, not an easy task. As a University of Governance in Berlin, the Hertie School is dedicated to intellectual and practical exchange between science and politics, working together to find the best solutions for the common good. An international university, we are firmly committed to bringing insights from abroad to Germany and work towards joint solutions, with over 800 students coming from more than 80 countries. Most of our students will continue to work in Europe or with the European Union as one of their focus areas, and I'm truly delighted to see so many of you in the room today. As an institution, the Hertie School lives the spirit of European cooperation through our European University Alliance Civica, which also includes our Swedish partner, the Stockholm School of Economics. Connecting people ensures that we can share our best ideas, innovation, and talents. Making Europe greener, safer, and stronger, and more democratic concerns every single one of us. It is not only a matter of necessity, it is also always an active decision to be made for cooperation, human rights, freedom, and our common future. Thank you so much, Mr. Prime Minister, that you will not only share your vision, but also answer questions from the audience. We are very pleased that one of Europe's most innovative thinkers, Professor Ulf van Middelaar, has accepted to moderate the question and answer session that will follow your keynote address. A historian and philosopher, Ulf van Middelaar is professor at Leiden University and founder of the Brussels Institute for Geopolitics. Thank you too for being part of this event and for staying with us this evening to share your vision or your analysis of Europe's strategic map at 6 p.m. Now please join me in welcoming Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson.
Thank you so much, and thank you for this kind introduction. I'm really pleased to be here. It is a true privilege, honestly, not only being the Prime Minister of Sweden and having the chance to have the presidency of the European Union, but also to meet with you guys. I really have to say that. Politics in the corridors of power has its charm, but meeting people outside is actually even more inspiring. Just a few weeks ago, I met with students like you at the Kiev School of Economics. Now, seeing you all here, it strikes me all the similarities. You should see them. The main difference was perhaps they were so pleased by having Wi-Fi in the shelters downstairs to be able to continue studying without interruptions while they were interrupted. At the same time, it strikes me how extremely different life can be, exactly the same kind of life situation. The European Union, as we know it today, is by and large the product of post-war Europe, but also the product of post-communist Europe. And there is obviously no greater symbol for this situation than the city of Berlin. The city encapsulates the fate of an entire continent, destroyed and divided, and then rebuilt and reunited. Brick by brick, you recreated a war-torn country into a democratic, peaceful, and prosperous state. That is an achievement. I think the West German Wirtschaftswunder demonstrated to the whole world that progress actually was possible after a time of terrible destruction. And, perhaps most important, a country's past does not dictate a country's future. That is a promise to quite a few countries around the globe right now. That hard-earned peace is now under brutal attack. Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine marks the return of a large-scale war to Europe. And just like the Second World War and the fall of the Berlin Wall, I think it will change Europe permanently. After the 24th of February last year, neither our security arrangements nor our trade ties or, as you mentioned, our energy systems will ever return to normal again. Instead, we have come to a turning point in history. Zeitenwende, as I think quite a few of you would have put it. And if we want European values, those mentioned, respect for international law, democracy, sovereignty, and human dignity, if we want these values to prevail, we must help Ukraine win this existential war. In this struggle, Germany and Sweden can play a critical role. And honestly, we do. Every day in the EU and through our own specific country-wise initiatives. Only a few weeks ago, our two countries agreed to collaborate on providing additional advanced air defense capabilities to Ukraine. A year ago, that would have been unthinkable. And we are working closely together to support Ukraine with the Leopard 2 tanks. And by lunchtime today, I'm going to personally thank Olaf Scholz for his leadership in making that possible. Germany and Sweden are both engineering nations, and in the 20th century, Sweden underwent a voyage from a rural poverty to becoming an advanced industry and welfare state. At the end of the previous century, Sweden was actually one of the poorest countries in Europe. One of the poorest countries in Europe. So poor, actually, that in fact, 1867, Sweden received humanitarian aid from Great Britain to fend off starvation. A century later, Sweden, like the West Germany, had become one of the most modern industrial nations in Europe. The Volvo Amazon, before Amazon became Amazon. Exactly like the Volkswagen Beetle became a symbol of European creativity and technological excellence, made affordable for most ordinary people. In short, modern Europe was built by engineers, by people who had a long-term vision, but also the means and the capabilities and the abilities to fulfill it. Not just in the professional sense, but also, honestly, in the political sense. Because modern Europe was built on the principles of free competition, of common rules, and a level playing field. However, this stands in a stark contrast to the developments over the last 15 or so years. The global realities have been heavily marked by crisis, as you mentioned. The EU, its member states, and the rest of the world have had to focus on constant emergency measures. Overall, that has been successful here in Europe. First came the Eurozone crisis, which threatened to topple the common currency and force southern member states into bankruptcy. Then came the migration crisis, which put a heavy burden on both Germany and Sweden, not least Germany and Sweden. The COVID-19 pandemic was another difficult crisis we managed to get through together as Europeans in a better shape than most people actually could expect. But just when that was almost over, Russia decided to create a security crisis of historic proportions. We in the EU haven't had to endure the same direct and tragic effects of the invasion as our Ukrainian friends have had to. Nevertheless, this is our crisis as well. The war has forced us to deal with a broad range of consequences, not at all the ones our Ukrainian friends face, but nevertheless, not least skyrocketing energy prices and general inflation. For the last 15 years, the EU has not acted as an engineer, but rather as a firefighter, trying to put out one fire after the next. Of course, I do not mean we do not need firefighters. Obviously not. On the contrary. In Sweden, we really know the importance of firefighters all too well, as EU support was essential in fighting the massive forest fires that afflicted our country just 5 years ago. And you should know that the German and the Polish firefighters who came to our side, they were welcomed like heroes in Sweden. But the Union is and must be much more than a world-class troubleshooter. With crisis management skills alone, Europe will never be able to take control of our own destiny. Let me therefore explain how I think the EU can become more like an engineer again, looking specifically at 3 areas: security, competitiveness, and global democratic alliances. Let me start with the obvious question of security. Putin has brought geopolitics back on the agenda. We did not face the end of history, as you all know. And that has made one thing extremely clear. Europe must take greater responsibility for its own security. For Sweden, this has meant substantially strengthening our own security by enhancing civil and military defense. We have applied for NATO membership after 200 years of non-alignment, Zeitenwende. It also means strengthening EU security. Here, the work has already begun with the strategic compass, and we must continue to advance that kind of work. The EU has an important role to play as a complement, not as a competitor, to NATO. Russia's war against Ukraine has also brought enlargement back on the agenda. Although integrating additional countries into the EU will be difficult, let's be honest about that. The alternative is to give free rein to Russian and Chinese influence. Let us be honest about that as well. That would be the least desirable outcome, both for the EU and, not least, for all the aspiring countries in our neighborhood. So the object should be clear: to continue giving strong support to the candidate countries in their own reform efforts, not least Ukraine. The key word in the Brussels language is and should be merit-based. A merit-based process towards membership. But when Ukraine and other candidate countries are ready to join the EU, we, who are already in the club, must be prepared to welcome them and mean what we are saying. Just as we need to start building the foundations for further enlargement, we need to build the foundation for a greener and more competitive European economy. And we must remember that there is no such thing as European autonomy without European competitiveness. Never forget that kind of connection. Alarmingly, I don't think we currently recognize that enough. The EU lags behind partners, not least American partners and Asian partners. By some reason, the technology front seems to be on the American West Coast and on the Chinese East Coast. That is not a necessity. Between 2014 and 2019, European firms, they grew on average 40% more slowly than their US peers, and they invested 40% less in R&D. In 10 years, the share of European companies in the Fortune 500 dropped from 32% to 23%. These things are moving in the wrong direction. We cannot allow them to continue doing that. What we need is not only responsive measures, but also a long-term vision. What does it take to return Europe to its position at the forefront? How can we strengthen our economic base for future successes? I think we must, first and foremost, build on the single market. This is a huge success, celebrating its 30th anniversary this year. Deepening the single market, re-emphasizing sound competition, open for services, the digital single market. All these things are next steps to be taken. State aid, very often discussed these days, is indeed something necessary to overcome market failures sometimes, but cannot be the norm. We politicians are at best skilled regulators. We are very rarely skilled investors. And when we finally make free movement of service a reality, it should be based more on mutual trust than on all these complicated European rules. European business, that is for sure, does not need more red tape. I'm certain there is a broad support for this basic view, both in Germany and Sweden, not only because we would be winners, but also because we realize other countries would be winners. Already in the Middle Ages, the Hanseatic League created one of the most advanced trading networks in the Baltic Sea region. And as a result, cities all around the sea prospered from trade, investments, and the free movement of ideas. We were early adopters. Realizing the historic importance of knowledge and ideas, how can we continue to invest so much less in research than our competitors actually do? Why are we unable to reach even the EU goal of investing 3% of GDP in research and development? Well, this simply won't do. Again, we must think more like an engineer. A house won't stand if the foundation is weak. Let's take care of the foundation. And finally, we need a free and open trade agenda. This does not mean continuing with the same strategy as before. The current geopolitical reality forces us to adapt. There is no room for naivety any longer. We cannot afford to put all our eggs in the same basket, being overly reliant on individual suppliers of energy or of critical raw materials. But we can never become self-sufficient either, not even in Europe. Therefore, I believe the EU needs a strong trade agenda that allows us to diversify our supply chains and access world markets together with like-minded partners. I stress, with like-minded partners. We spend nowadays, and increasingly, a lot of time discussing China's changing role in the world, and there is a good reason for that. I've personally spent the last 20 years trying to understand what does China think, as the Mark Leonard book is titled. And we should continue to do so, with open eyes, but also with an open mind. EU unity and solidarity on China, they are key. EU needs to stay united, as our close dialogues and cooperation with allies and like-minded partners, not least the United States. Our basic lesson to learn is that when Europe and the United States are aligned, there is an enormous force in our democratic societies. In all aspects of cooperation, from defense to climate and environment, to economy and to trade, the transatlantic link is a cornerstone of EU interests. I do think that quite a few small countries in EU has a special insight regarding this theme. And building on this bridge over the Atlantic is perhaps our most important geopolitical task to safeguard fundamental European and Western values. The case of Ukraine once again demonstrates the value of this mutually reinforcing cooperation. Our invaluable cooperation on Russia's war in Ukraine should serve as a reminder that the discussion about the US Inflation Reduction Act, the ERA you have heard of, is and should be a debate between friends, where we seek the best possible solutions. We are not pushovers, but we know who our friends are. We must therefore not abandon the idea of future and better trade relations, and we should continue to build on the EU-US Trade and Technology Council. A strong democratic alliance between the EU and its transatlantic partners is fundamental to the rules-based international order, and Europe and America are the two bridgeheads of Western civilization. Well, to conclude here today, this year, going back to my home country, Sweden, we celebrate 500 years as an independent nation. In 1522, that was 1 year before becoming the father of our nation, the future king Gustav Vasa, he actually bought 10 ships from the German city of Lübeck. He would use those ships to lead the struggle for national liberation. In 1523, he was elected king, of course, in my hometown Strängnäs, very nearby the church, some 100 meters from my family's house. Well, Sweden is indeed quite a small country. But this also gives us some perspective on the European project and the prospects for the EU. Because the European project is a rather new creation in consideration of the long history of Europe's nations, and an immense amount of time now lies ahead of us. What pleasures and pains await us in the coming centuries? We have no idea. It is as hard to predict today as I think it was for Berliners in the 1980s to anticipate the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and as it was in 1963 for the people who listened to President John F. Kennedy when he famously declared that he also was a Berliner. We can't predict the future, Therefore, we all have a responsibility to act like engineers and to build Europe stronger today. To build Europe greener, safer, freer. To help future generations to meet all the challenges we cannot yet foresee. I can honestly hardly think of no nobler task than this, and I can hardly think of any better task for students like you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Prime Minister, for this very stimulating, engaging speech with this audience full of historic references, Lübeck and 200 years of non-alignment and many other strong convictions as well, European convictions. And I'm sure there will be many questions also from the audience, from students, ambassadors, perhaps also from members of the press, although to them I should say they get a second and perhaps more appropriate opportunity later in the afternoon at the Federal Chancellery, while you will be speaking alongside.
That was a clear signal. Yeah.
No, but of course you are open to questions coming from Sweden, which with its strong tradition of freedom of the press. Which brings me, perhaps, while you make up your mind on questions you want to ask to the Prime Minister, I may perhaps kick off the conversation and get you going on one of the very powerful images you used in your speech, this distinction between the Europe of a decade or 15 years even of firefighting and what we really need, in your view at least also, is engineering, building, laying stronger foundations for Europe. You mentioned economy, you mentioned security, of course. But I guess that engineering, that also comes with our capacity to look better ahead, to be not each time surprised by new events, new crises, new fires to extinguish, as you mentioned. So I was wondering, you as a political leader with your long experience in your country, now also more and more internationally, what is your method for this looking ahead? How do you identify trends? How do you design responses? And then how do you bring others, parties, the public, on board? Please.
Thank you so much. Well, obviously that is complicated. Just to state the obvious, it is complicated, and I think it's perhaps more complicated now than it used to be 30, 40, 50 or 100 years ago. When I read books about previous prime ministers of Sweden, they seem to have amounts of time. And they did not have social media. So, I mean, there are obvious... I think, for me, I try to use a kind of a rule of thumb, saying if you really... You spend your time in doing what you really need to do and what you like to do. And then you try to avoid all the things in the between. What you need to do, take care of crises, doing complicated stuff you wish you didn't have to do, and then meet people you like to meet. I did not come here because I had to, because I wanted to. I think that is a way of trying to kind of influence yourself as well. If you cannot handle crisis, you will not survive in this environment. And that goes for companies as well. You have to be kind of be fast sometimes. But if you don't have an idea on where you're heading, I used to be the mayor of my hometown, Strängnäs, and I was fascinated by doing things every day, you know. Pretty small things, though. And every week I had to stop and say, what are we really doing? We are taking care of stuff all the time. Where are we heading? What should the future of this city be? The kids who are not in school yet, but when they are students, what kind of city will they live in then? So try to use that. And I realize that you're always kind of non-pleased because you always think you should do more than you do. I admit that.
So that is your method is very much also a personal one of making the distinction between what you really like to do and what you need to do. And does that enough?
Well, the more you do things in the short term, the more you need to have a long-term vision of where you're heading. And the more you are anchored in a long-term vision, the more you have to prove your capability of getting things done as well. It's so easy to be a philosopher, honestly. Sorry. You are needed as well. But in politics, I would say, just to be the philosopher, thinking good stuff, never producing, that won't work simply. And just being, the person who does things all the time but have no clue actually where his country or his city or his university is heading. I think that's not enough. Well, the lesson learned, I think, for this crisis management is really an absolute necessity, but it's not sufficient. And there I think our engineering traditions in Sweden and Germany actually could help us quite a lot.
Yeah, that was a nice image as well, the Volvo Amazon and the Volkswagen Beetle, right? So you will have something to discuss with the other Olaf later today. Maybe one question on security, because before we open up, because I think this Zeitenwende moment of last year has impressed the whole of Europe. Huh? Of course, the countries closest to Russia, but I think societies as far away, and Spain and Portugal, they were impressed as well what happened. And also the position of your country, I think, has really made an impression. The fact that Sweden, as you also said here, after 200 years of non-alignment, so we're going all the way back to Napoleon, basically, now decides to join a military alliance. That is a really powerful sign of the changing times. But of course, as a philosopher, I cannot stop thinking that this will also bring new tensions for politicians, new dilemmas, perhaps even ethical dilemmas, also for you and for Sweden, because of course, on the one hand, there's Sweden's reputation as a beacon of human rights and free press, as we mentioned, and being a good place for refugees as well, important for your reputation, your self-image. On the other hand, there is now a strategic need to rethink your security, to anchor your country differently in the European security architecture to join NATO. Now, of course, these are two important goals, but they are not always so easy to reconcile. Let me put it diplomatically. And so sometimes there may be dilemmas, trade-offs, compromises to be made. And so my question here is, respectively to the practitioner, how do you deal with these tensions? How do you explain them, for instance, to students here or in your country, to your parliament, that it is not always so easy, perhaps as it used to be pre-Zeitenwende?
Well, I think you put it extremely well. It is that complicated. There are dilemmas, there are trade-offs. Let's be honest about that. I think you need to say that we have convictions, we have beliefs, we stand up for those. They're worth a price as well. But we also have national security concerns. And we need others' protection. And we do believe that we have something to offer as well. So it's not black and white. Black or white, there are nuances, and you need to admit all these trade-offs. And I think the public is kind of wise enough to understand that. On the contrary, I would say, to just sit on your hands and say, well, we are too noble to take part of defending the Western world. That wouldn't impress. Ask the Ukrainians if that would impress on them. It wouldn't. So I think there are many reasons for this non-alignment. There are nuances, of course, but I think that this is also Sweden's kind of the new the meeting with realpolitik, basically. That the world isn't the way we would like the world to be, but you have to face the world as it is. And you have to cooperate with countries that are more like you, defending basically the same values without approving everything they do. I think that is a healthy, actually. In my government declaration to the parliament, I said, we stick to defend the values that Sweden have always defended. We also bring into consideration national security concerns. And that is a combination. And you have to have that discussion more or less every day.
So, and you also feel that the Swedish public is ready for this kind of message, seeing also the situation of Ukraine and the Western world?
I do, absolutely. And I mean, obviously the disastrous invasion has changed things because, you know, half the parliament was more or less clearly in favor of Swedish NATO membership even before but it was kind of a non-issue basically. The day before the invasion, I did visit the Finnish president, Sauli Niinistö, and obviously we did not know that the invasion were to come the day after, but we were discussing the future steps for Sweden and Finland because they were in a kind of a similar situation. And we realized that things can change. And I think given the fact that Sweden, so to speak, went into the EU without really consulting Finland, I think he said something, don't be too rushy into NATO. Now we see that Finland is obviously being invited to NATO before Sweden. That kind of creates a self-confident problem perhaps in Sweden. But still, I've always said that all the countries that need to ratify that they do it according to their own agenda. But I think it has changed very material kind of foundations for Sweden and Finland.
Very interesting. Well, I have many more questions to ask, but no doubt so has the public, so have members of the public. Perhaps if somebody wants to raise a hand, any of the students there, I see a hand there, the young man. I presume there are mics which would come along. If not, then just stand up and speak loudly. And just say your name, please. And whether you are here at Hertie or...
Can I start? Thank you so much for taking the time today. My name is Ariana. I'm a master's in public policy student. I'm also very short.
The second question will be for the young gentleman here, but there's a fight for the mic. Please, can you say your name again?
Ariana.
Ariana.
Yes. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. It was really interesting hearing about your visions both for Sweden and Europe and outlining the priorities. In speaking about tough choices, I was wondering if you could speak more about how dropping Sweden's aid commitment fits in line with your short and long-term visions that you talked about.
Sorry, Sweden's what? Sweden's?
Dropping Sweden's aid commitment.
Aid commitment, sorry. Well, speaking about trade-offs, Sweden, I think Sweden was on the list of top 3 countries trying to reach the 1%, far above the 0.0% goal. I think Sweden, was it Luxembourg and Norway? And we, in a more principled sense, I did find it hard to defend a specific figure saying at any cost we should reach 1%. In a more pragmatic sense, that created in these kind of dramatic economic times big shifts all the time, dramatic increase in spending some years without continuing these increases. And for a few years we had decreases. So we turned to another model saying that we have long-term programs, still being, I would say, one of the 5 top donors in the Western world. So I'm really not ashamed about that. But we thought it was not defendable to say that one single part of the whole budget had a precise and restricted area where all the other parts, defense, education, health. All the other parts were up for constant assessment and constant negotiations. And we made that agreement, basically. Everybody doesn't love it, honestly. Nobody seems to try to change it. That's sometimes one of the obligations you have as a government. Do what you think is necessary, even though someone will complain. And then you see, if people stop complaining, you probably were pretty right.
Well, that's a clear answer to a very clear question as well. Now, young man over there, please.
Okay, my name is Victor. I'm a Hertie student. And my question from greener, freer, and safer would be about greener. And many analysts are considering that reactivating some coal mines or enlarging oil extraction operations might signal a short and mid-term trade-off between green and competitiveness or growth. So I would like to know, how do you envision this discussion?
To start off in another, in the same question, but in another perspective. Obviously, as you know, you who are interested in energy politics and stuff like that, you realize that Sweden and Germany has taken very different routes in this. Sweden, we was a pioneer in nuclear energy, and then we have, in my eyes, by mistake, taken away, shut down half of the capacity, and now we are rebuilding nuclears again, together with France and Finland and other countries. And I know that, and I fully respect that the German way ahead is different. The similarities, though, is that we actually combine in politics climate, energy, and business issues in a combined ministry. I think that's key. We looked quite a lot to Germany when we recreated the governmental body in Sweden, because we realized simply there is no climate policies without energy policies, regardless what you think about nuclears. And the business community is a crucial part of fighting climate change and sustainability issues. So I think to use the driving force in the business community is extremely important. But they need regulations as well, obviously. That's one of the reasons why we are fully behind the regulation of stop selling combustion engines from 2035. I know this is also a discussion. I will not go into that.
I was very happy to do so also on behalf of the members of the...
My principal point is this. I do believe that business community and consumers, investors, and civil society are very powerful forces in what we are doing right now, but they also need robust and long-term regulations they can believe in and actually act within. So I think there are a few lessons learned here, actually.
Yeah, you mentioned the divergent traditions between Sweden and Germany in this respect, in the choice of green energy and nuclear. There seem also to be, and you mentioned it yourself, divergence at the moment between the Swedish car maker tradition, of Volvo really going green and phasing out of the combustible engine, and what seems to be now a German hesitation suddenly with this new deadline. I guess it is one of the unexpected surprises that you also encounter in your role as EU Council presidency. Would you care to comment on that, or you keep it for later in the afternoon?
Well, I mean, once again, to state the obvious, when you try to make 27 countries agree on things, that's complicated. When I met your fellow students in Kiev, they asked me, how can it be so damn complicated to make these 27 countries agreeing on making Ukraine an EU member state? And I said, well, it is complicated. And when you are in, the 28 countries will have complications in making a decision of inviting the 29th country. I mean, that's the name of the game. So simply realize that it is too slow when you want something yourself. It's too fast when you try to stop something, and that's actually the name of the game. I think the single market and the common rules in areas where we really have to have a playing level field, that is extremely important. And therefore, I think, and I do believe that your automotive industry is also turning very green, and that I think every car maker realizes that green cars are the future. But the fact that different countries are in a different setting, dependent on different industries. I mean, the same goes in another way. We mentioned China. Very different countries are very differently dependent on Chinese trade. And of course, that perhaps, you shouldn't say that that affects their principal views on human rights, but it does affect the speediness they have in making very harsh demands on China, for example. So every country cannot act like Lithuania, which I respect. So I think this is the way. You need to have some kind of patience if you want 27 countries or even more to be able to cooperate. But there is actually no good alternative.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm looking at the room here. There's a student, I think, here up front. Please. Yeah, I can take two as well. At the back, there's two students standing there. The young woman, yes, please. So first here, you up front, and then the young lady at the back, standing.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, for coming here today. I must say, as a Swedish student myself, it's a pleasure to have you here. I'm from Örebro, which is, I see, not too far from Strängnäs. So having the small cities also represented in the halls of power, I feel, is very appropriate. I was very interested in what you said about engineers and firefighters. And we're seeing right now the defense industry and the armed forces are being used as firefighters in this crisis. How can we ensure that they turn into engineers? How do we ensure that once this crisis is not over, that we then turn back to the comfortable moments that we saw after the Cold War, when defense spending went down, when we saw there was no longer a need for it, we saw other issues. I think defense expenditure is too important not to consider as an insurance for all the other things, for the green, for the freedoms, and for the financial situation, our well-being that we have. So how do we ensure that we build on this momentum, and the second this war ends, and the second this crisis ends, that we don't fall back to our model, basically? Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you for that question. Then the young lady in the back, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, first of all, for taking the time speaking to us today. I'm Georgia. I'm a master's student of international affairs here at Hertie. You talk about a safer and a freer Europe, but having a humanitarian background, working and being criminalized for working with refugees, I cannot help to wonder, but for whom? The EU has been rightfully criticized for its handling of the so-called refugee crisis, and considering the rise of far-right populist movements in Europe, I would like to ask you, how do you think that the EU can better address the issues of European externalization and create a more realistic narrative about refugees, whilst, of course, also taking in consideration national security concerns?
I think, Prime Minister, if you could answer these two questions directly or indirectly, also security and trade-off related.
I'll try to be very brief, even though they're big and extremely interesting questions, both of them. In terms of defense spendings and defense industry, obviously everybody would prefer a world where we didn't have to have defense industries at all. Likewise, obviously, we're not in that position right now. And I think the lesson we have learned now is that it's much better to be prepared, to have the security before you really need it. And I think as long as we have a country like Russia right now, but we see quite a few other countries around the world who are threatening their neighbors in a globalized world, thereby threatening very many neighbors, I think it's simply absolutely necessary that we have a very, very strong defense. And besides from that, there are so many similarities and connections between defense industry and other advanced industries. traditionally you said that defense industry creates kind of civil utilities and civil use. Now I would say a lot of the people in the tech industry and in computer science, they also nowadays are very useful in defense industry as well. So I see, in that sense, I see the potential for very advanced industry also through defense industry. Just one more point. Just before the war broke out, or before the invasion, you heard a lot in the discussion of sustainability, what are truly sustainable investments. And I think that's a healthy discussion. If you want to be green, you want to be sustainable, you have to ask yourself what the investments are really in the long run sustainable. And people often try to suggest that spending or investments in arms industry is not sustainable. Ask the Ukrainians if they agree. They do not. So we have lost that discussion, which is good, I would say, to defend the open society, to defend democracy. That is a sustainable effort. And that needs also sustainable industries helping us to do that. So, but I understand your question. The refugee crisis, there are so many layers in that, and we're going to have it on the European Council again. As you who followed the European Council affairs, you know that we had a discussion last time on that specific topic, not because really of the experience we have in Germany and Sweden, but nowadays the experience they have in the Netherlands, experience from Austria, from Belgium, from quite a few countries. And they are simply saying, and some people think they say it in a blunt way, but they are simply saying, if we do not have control of our external borders, there is simply no possibility to have open internal borders. And I agree. Then you can have different views on how many refugees should Europe altogether accept, on what criteria should you be given the right to stay in Europe. But I think most countries do agree that if you have criteria, you also will have to apply them, and thereby making people leave Europe who are not entitled to be here. Because otherwise you create what we have in Sweden now in quite a big problem. Some 50, 60, nobody knows, 1,000 people staying in Sweden. They are not entitled to stay here. They stay here anyway. They are being used for criminal purposes. They might commit crimes as well. Their kids have a very tough situation. So you have to acknowledge the fact that if you are a welfare state and you want to keep that welfare state, there are limits, and you have to apply the rules you actually have decided on in a democratic way. But it is complicated, just to acknowledge your question.
I think we have time for 2 more questions from the room. I have a young lady here, the 3rd row, and then a gentleman at the back. And there's 2 in line, but I'll give the generational advantage to the young man sitting behind. Apologies.
Thank you so much. My name is Lisa Delmut. I'm a guest professor at Hertie from Stockholm University. Your speech was heavily anchored in geopolitical discourse, which I really appreciate, but it also omits citizen perspectives and social issues, and the, I think, ever-pressing matter of bringing citizens closer to Europe and Europe closer to the citizens. I think one of the previous speakers mentioned the rise of the far-right movements and an increasing number of voters who vote for anti-EU parties over the past decade. So I was wondering for the Council presidency about your vision and perhaps concrete steps to bring Europe closer to the citizens.
Very good question. And then the other question, also say your name, please.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Professor. Prime Minister, my question for you is specifically regarding to a comment you made on no European...
And what's your name, please?
Sorry. My name is Shubhranshu. I'm a MPP student at Hertie.
Great.
Yeah. So my question is with respect to a specific comment you made on no European autonomy without European competitiveness. Now, when you talk about competitiveness, what comes to my mind is the IRA, which you talked about. And when you talk about autonomy, what comes to my mind is about the energy security and the defense deals, specifically with the US. Don't you think this, in a way, in the long term, will make Europe and maybe Sweden more dependent on US? And if that's the case, how do you sort of exercise your autonomy and competitiveness in the long run vis-a-vis the US? Yeah, thank you.
So 2 final questions from the audience. I think they bring in 2 new perspectives which you haven't addressed yet: the communication citizen dimension and the EU-US relationship.
Well, first of all, just to confirm, geopolitics is back. Just to state the obvious, and we had a decade or so when we thought that globalization we got rid of geopolitics in a spirit of globalization. I think we have learned now that that is not the case. That is not a way of saying that globalization and sourcing and value chains should return to something else. Absolutely not. And I'm fiercely against all these attempts to only promote people to buy things from your own home country, to all these things. But I do think we have learned that you cannot be over-dependent on countries that simply do not share the basic values of your own way of doing business. Or even more so, you cannot allow one country access to your own markets in a way you would not be allowed in return. In the long term, that is simply not acceptable. So I think geopolitics is, for good and for worse, back on the agenda. The complicated question of the EU closer to the citizen, I mean, sometimes that is been described as an EU problem. I would say it's more like all the democratic states have the problem in terms that how to make citizens really become, truly interested in what's happening in the political arena, realizing that some things you actually do take care of in Stockholm or in Strängnäs or in Lübeck or in Berlin, other things in your country, and a few things on an international level. And where are these international levels? And I guess most people, they want to have a legitimate system and they want to produce results. And in the long term, you will never be able to have legitimacy without producing results. I think that you have to face that. If you don't solve a problem, then you become a problem. And I think Europe, having said that, I think Europe has proved our ability to solve problems as well. That's why I'm not complaining about the firefighter. I say the firefighter was necessary, fighting the Eurozone crisis, fighting the pandemic, now uniting in helping Ukraine to win the war. But that is not sufficient. You need to do more. So that's my basic point, having the long-term vision as well. And speaking about long-term vision, that goes to Europe will never become the US and should not, and don't try to become the US. But quite a lot of our competitors are in other parts of the world. We are a big market, that's fair enough. We try to converge on our rules, that's fair enough. But the US has a speediness in many senses that Europe lacks. To some extent it's necessary because 27 countries needs to agree. US is one country. China has another way of doing business, so to speak, and not least making decisions. So I think just to face it, we need to improve our abilities, not least in the future kind of technologies, and that's where I'm mostly concerned. We are lagging behind in patents, we are lagging behind in AI, we are lagging behind in quite a few of the tech sectors. That's not to say we don't have them. We have Ericsson. I'm proud about that. You have quite a few impressive companies as well. But if you compare Europe to the American West Coast and the Chinese East Coast, we have quite a few things to think about. Finally, ERA. Once again, you need to have some nuances. Let me just say, it's good to have US back on track in fighting climate change. That needs to be said. You need to acknowledge that. It's good. Just a few years ago, we were bothered, truly bothered, by having an American administration just seem not to care at all. So it's much better. It's also good that the US are reacting on what China has been doing in different markets for a long time. I think Europe has been slow in realizing those dangers. That is not to say decoupling. I use the phrase that I think Ursula von der Leyen, de-risk. You need to de-risk. So there are good intentions behind what the US is doing. And then there are problematic consequences that we try to mitigate as far as possible. And I think we will be able to find solutions on that. No perfect ones, but reasonable ones. That's at least my aim for the coming months of influence.
Thank you, thank you. Let me ask one final question, because I know you will have to leave soon, and so has your delegation, but also on these next months. In your capacity as Swedish Prime Minister, you have also automatically been made a member of one of the most exclusive clubs in Europe, which is the European Council, the summits. Huh? And from here you will pay a visit to your German colleague, Olaf Scholz, no doubt also to discuss next week's EU summit, for instance. Now, I was just wondering whether in the intimacy of this room, or the relative intimacy of this room, you could share a few first experiences. You arrived last October, you've had now maybe 2-3 summits, in this very wily group between Emmanuel, Pedro, Olaf, Ursula, Georgia. So what has surprised you most? Let's make it easy.
Well, honestly, what does strike me, or did strike me, was actually that there is a truly friendly and informal atmosphere, and that can sound a bit kind of strange, but I guess it's a closed room with not one single aide, not one single staff member. You're on your own, so to speak. I asked my people, how does it work in the room? And they said, well, we have no clue because we have never been there. So I did call my predecessor on my way to my first meeting and said, well, how does it work? And she gave me a very, very generous description of what happened. And that was true. So it's very informal, it's friendly, because everybody in the room, they know that we are the ones who know how it is actually. The problems, the risk you take, the risks of democratic elections. You can get in, you can get out, all that stuff. So there is a very kind of, even when we disagree, and we certainly do, we disagree in a very respectful way, and we try to make progress. So that's one. Another reflection, of course, is that when I realized the fact that we were having the presidency and the days around Christmas, I read a few books about previous presidencies, and I thought, well, I need to talk to the guys who have been there before. So I invited 2 people for dinner, the Prime Minister of Göran Persson in Sweden, who had the presidency in 2001, and my own predecessor, Fredrik Reinfeldt, who had the presidency in 2009. And they were extremely generous in giving me pieces of advice in do's and don'ts, and share their mistakes and successes. And then say, well, Göran Persson said, well, it was an awful luck that I had been Prime Minister for 5 years before I got this task. And Fredrik said, well, at least I had 3 years of experience, and was like, I have 12 weeks of experience. But I think so far so good. Yeah.
Well, sounds indeed good, and that you're fully at home around that table. Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, so much for engaging so openly, frankly, and warmly with this whole audience. Cornelia Wool was greet us all out, but maybe we can already have a first round of applause.
Thank you so much. Thank you.